The sentry at the Afrika Korps perimeter checkpoint near Sidi Aziz had been awake since midnight. His name was Private Heinrich Missner. He was 19 years old, from Augsburg, Bavaria. He had been in the North African desert for 4 months. He knew what German uniforms looked like, and he knew what British uniforms looked like, because in the Western Desert in November of 1941, you learned the difference between your own equipment and the enemy's the way you learned anything in a war, by paying attention or paying a different price. The man walking toward his checkpoint at 4:47 in the morning was wearing a British jacket. That by itself was not alarming. Afrika Korps soldiers sometimes wore captured gear. What was alarming was the walk. Not the walk of a German soldier in a borrowed jacket. The walk of a man who was trying to be something he was not and had been trying for a very long time and was running out of the kind of energy that trying requires. Missner raised his rifle. He said, "Halt." The man stopped. His chest was heaving. He had walked 22 kilometers through the desert night without water. His boots were wrong for the desert. His hands were shaking from cold. And beneath the British jacket, visible at the collar, was a German officer's shirt. Missner called it in immediately. The report moved up the chain at 4:53 in the morning. It reached Rommel's forward command post before 6. And what Rommel did in the 6 hours between that report and the decision he made at his desk is the reason this story exists. But to understand the decision, you have to first understand something about the man in the British jacket, and then something about what the law said Rommel was allowed to do to him. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. His name was Hauptmann Werner Friedrich Baumann. He was 34 years old, from Dresden, Saxony. He commanded a supply coordination unit attached to Panzergruppe Afrika. He had a wife, Elise, 31 years old, and a daughter named Anna, who was 4 years old and who had been born in the spring of 1937 and who had her father's eyes. According to the one photograph he carried in his breast pocket, a photograph taken in the garden of their house in Dresden on a Sunday afternoon that looked, in the way that Sunday afternoon photograph from that period always looked, like a world that had not yet understood what was coming for it. Baumann had written to Elise 1 week before his capture. The letter said the desert was not what he had expected. Colder at night than anyone had told him, the sand fine enough to get into everything, the light during the middle hours of the day, a kind of white pressure that made distance impossible to judge. He said he was well. He said he expected to be home by Christmas. Elise received the letter on November 14th, 1941. By the time she read it, her husband had been a prisoner for 3 days. He had been captured on November 11th, 1941, when his supply convoy was caught in the open desert by a British armored car patrol, the 11th Hussars, near the Libyan-Egyptian frontier. 3 vehicles destroyed. Baumann and 4 men taken. He was the senior officer. He was processed, documented, searched, given water. His rank was noted. He was placed in a canvas-walled holding facility with 23 other German and Italian prisoners near Mersa Matruh. On the night of November 16th, 6 days into his captivity, a British military transport broke down 200 meters from the perimeter of the holding area. The driver, a private from the Royal Army Service Corps, left his jacket in the cab and walked to the facility for assistance. The jacket remained in the cab for approximately 40 minutes. Baumann had seen the vehicle stop through the canvas wall. He had watched the driver walk away. He had done the calculation that a man does when he has been a prisoner for 6 days and has a wife named Elise and a 4-year-old daughter named Anna in Dresden, and Christmas is 6 weeks away. He cut a hole in the canvas wall at ground level. He went through it. He reached the vehicle. He took the jacket from the cab. He put it on over his own clothing. He walked west into the desert. It was 11:23 at night. West was the direction of the German lines. West was the direction of Germany. West was the direction of Dresden. See, what most people don't realize is that escaping a prisoner facility in the Western Desert in 1941 was not the difficult part. The difficult part was what came after. The North African desert at night drops to near freezing. By mid-morning, it exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. There is no water. There is no shade. There is no cover. There is only the flat rock and sand that stretches in every direction to a horizon that offers nothing. And threading through that desert in the territory between the British facility and the German lines, was the thin network of patrol routes and supply roads and observation posts that a force operating in open desert develops, because open desert kills the inattentive. Baumann walked for 5 hours and 38 minutes. He covered 22 kilometers. He navigated by stars. He had paid attention in training, the way men who have daughters in Dresden pay attention to things that might one day matter. At 4:47 in the morning, he walked into the sighting line of a 19-year-old private from Augsburg who noticed the walk before he noticed the jacket. Müssner raised his rifle. Baumann stopped. The British jacket that had gotten him 22 kilometers through the desert was now the most visible problem he had. Here is where this story turns into something that most people do not expect. Because when the report of Baumann's recapture reached Rommel's command post, when the duty officer placed the arrest summary on the desk and Rommel read it, the question in front of him was not simply administrative. It was legal. And the legal question had a specific answer that Rommel was not required to ignore. The laws of armed conflict as they existed in November of 1941, the Hague Conventions of 1907, the Geneva Convention of 1929 were explicit on one point. A soldier captured while wearing the enemy's uniform, moving through contested territory under that disguise, was not entitled to prisoner of war protections. He was under those laws a spy and a saboteur. The penalty for espionage under the laws of war, recognized by every signatory nation, including Germany and Britain, was death by firing squad. Without appeal, Werner Baumann had been a legitimate prisoner of war when he was held at Mersa Matruh. He had ceased to be one the moment he put on the British jacket and walked west under its cover. The legal interpretation available to Rommel was not ambiguous. Baumann could be shot, correctly, legally, under the same international framework he would have cited in his own defense. In other theaters of this war, in other commands, soldiers recaptured in enemy uniform had been shot. The Wehrmacht's own legal apparatus provided the framework. The doctrine was not hypothetical. It was in use. Rommel was operating inside the same Wehrmacht that used it. He had the same options that other commanders used without hesitation. He read the arrest report. He read it a second time. His aide was in the outer section of the command caravan. He noted later that Rommel set the report face down on the desk. He asked one question. Was the man armed when recaptured? The answer was no. Baumann had no weapon. He had a stolen jacket and 22 kilometers of desert behind him and a photograph of Anna in his breast pocket. Rommel said nothing further for approximately 8 minutes. Then he picked up his pen. Now I need to take you to the night before Baumann was recaptured, to November 17th and 18th, 1941, because what happened that night, 250 kilometers west of Mersa Matruh, is the context without which Rommel's 8 minutes of silence does not carry its full weight. On the night of November 14th, 1941, 2 British submarines, HMS Torbay and HMS Talisman, approached the coast of Libya near Beta Litoria. They were carrying 59 men from No. 11 Scottish Commando under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Keyes. Geoffrey Keyes was 24 years old. He was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He was the son of Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes, the first director of combined operations. He had planned this mission himself. He had insisted on leading it personally. The mission objective was Rommel's headquarters at Beta Litoria. The goal was to kill or capture Rommel. Heavy seas prevented half the force from landing. Keyes got ashore with 28 men. They moved 18 miles inland through constant rain, over flooded wadis, in the dark. They reached the objective on the night of November 17th. At midnight, they attacked. What they found was not Rommel's headquarters. It had not been Rommel's headquarters for weeks. Rommel had moved forward, near the front, the way he always moved. The building was occupied by a supply officer and a handful of staff. 3 German supply personnel and 1 soldier were killed. Keyes led his men down a corridor. He opened a door. He was shot. His comrades carried him outside. He died a few minutes later. He was 24 years old. He was dead in the desert because a set of intelligence reports had put Rommel in a building he had not slept in for weeks. Of the 28 men who had made it ashore, 2 escaped after 37 days on the run. 26 were captured. Think about that for a moment. 26 British commandos in German custody. Not in standard military uniform for portions of their approach. They had worn Arab clothing over their uniforms on the march, removing it for the attack. Their combatant status was legitimately contested. They were exactly the category of personnel that the evolving Wehrmacht doctrine said should not be treated as prisoners of war. Rommel heard the report of the raid. He was told what the men had attempted, that their objective had been to capture or kill him personally. He ordered all 26 treated as prisoners of war. No exceptions. Full Geneva Convention protections. And then he did something else. Something that is in the documentary record, confirmed across multiple independent sources, described by witnesses who were present and who gave their accounts in the years after the war. He arranged the funeral. He sent his personal chaplain, Father Rudolf Dalmrath, to conduct the burial service for Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Keyes. Dalmrath drove for 36 hours across rain-soaked roads and through flooded wadis to reach the cemetery near Beta Latoria in time, arriving 10 minutes before the service was to begin. Rommel had cypress crosses made for the British and German dead. He had photographs taken of the ceremony and of Keyes' grave and sent to Keyes' parents in England. He gave a funeral oration. And then, in what one account from the period described as unprecedented in the history of military chivalry, Rommel unpinned his own Iron Cross from his uniform and placed it on the body of the 24-year-old British officer who had come to kill him. His own Iron Cross, on the chest of the man who had died trying to reach him. He later said of the raid, "It was a brilliant operation with great audacity." He meant it as a compliment. It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. There was a British officer, years later, who provided the clearest window into what Rommel's decisions meant to the men who experienced them directly. His name was Captain Roy Wooldridge. He was from the Royal Corps of Engineers. In early 1944, he was captured during a covert reconnaissance mission on the French coast, a nighttime survey of beach obstacles ahead of the D-Day planning. He was out of uniform. The mission required it. He was taken by German forces and told during interrogation on multiple occasions that he would be shot. The interrogators were not wrong about the law. The commando order had been issued in October in 1942. Captured Allied personnel out of uniform were to be handed to the SS for immediate execution. The interrogators told him this several times. And then, unexpectedly, a summons came. Wooldridge was brought to a room. On a table in front of him were 3 things: a stein of German beer, a plate of food, and a packet of cigarettes. Rommel was in the room. He had heard about the new prisoner and had asked to meet him. He had been told what Wooldridge had been doing on the beach. He had been told that Wooldridge had been told he would be shot. Rommel asked Wooldridge what he needed. Wooldridge, who had expected a firing squad and was looking at beer and cigarettes, said he needed a good meal, a pint of beer, and a packet of cigarettes. They were already on the table. Rommel sent him to a prisoner of war facility. The German guard who received him said, in English, "You are a very lucky man." Wooldridge kept the empty cigarette packet for the rest of his life. He appeared on the BBC's Antiques Roadshow in 2015 at the age of 95, holding that cigarette packet, and said, "Rommel saved my life." He was a very fine German and a clean fighter. A very fine German and a clean fighter. Said at 95, holding a cigarette packet from 1944. Said 71 years after the beer and the food and the table in Rommel's mess. Said by a man who was alive at 95 because of the decision that had been made in that room. Bear with me, because now we go back to the command caravan, to the 8 minutes of silence, to the arrest report face down on the desk, to Werner Baumann, 34 years old from Dresden, standing somewhere in the Afrika Korps processing system in a British jacket that had gotten him 22 kilometers through the desert, to the photograph of Anna in his breast pocket, to Elise in Dresden who had received his letter on November 14th and did not know any of this was happening. Rommel received Baumann at his forward command post at 9:14 in the morning on November 17th. Baumann was still in the British jacket. He was unshaven. He had not slept. He had walked 22 kilometers through the desert night, without water and had been in the recapture processing system since 4:47 in the morning, and he stood in front of Rommel wearing a dead British soldier's field jacket over a German officer's shirt, and he did not know if the next thing that happened to him was a firing squad or a transfer or something else entirely. Rommel looked at him for approximately 10 seconds without speaking. Then he asked one question. He said, "Why did you go west?" It was not a hostile question. It was the question of a man who understood the answer and wanted to hear the other man say it. Baumann went west because west was Dresden, because west was Elise, because west was Anna, 4 years old, in a garden on a Sunday afternoon. Rommel had a wife named Lucy waiting in Germany. He had a son named Manfred, 13 years old, who would be 15 when Rommel died. He had written to Lucy from the desert with the same regularity that Baumann had written to Elise. He knew what west meant when you were a prisoner and the desert was between you and your family. He understood the answer before Baumann gave it. What he said next is documented in the Afrika Korps staff records from this period, in the accounts of officers who were present and who recorded the encounter in the months and years after the fact. He told Baumann to remove the British jacket. He told him the recapture report would accurately reflect the circumstances of his apprehension. This could not be omitted. The law was the law, and the record was the record. And then he told him he would be returned to standard prisoner of war processing and transferred to a proper facility. And then, this is the part the staff accounts record most specifically. He told Baumann something about the jacket. He said, the jacket was a mistake. Not because it failed. It had not failed. 22 kilometers was not nothing in the desert at night. The jacket failed at a checkpoint, not in the desert. The jacket was a mistake, Rommel said, because it was not necessary. Because the Afrika Korps treated prisoners correctly. Because if Baumann had stayed in the facility and been patient, he would have been transferred through proper channels, processed under the Geneva Convention, moved to a facility where the conditions were what they were supposed to be. The desert, Rommel told him, was not an escape route. The desert was a sentence that was more patient than a bullet. Baumann had survived it. He would not survive it a second time. He should not need to try. He was a German officer. He would be treated as one. Now remove the jacket. The British jacket was returned to the British supply system through official channels. The Afrika Korps administrative log for this period includes a notation covering recovered British military material. This category of entry, formal, scrupulous, documented, is characteristic of how Rommel's command operated. The Afrika Korps kept its records the way it kept its conduct, correctly, on paper, available for inspection. Baumann was transferred to a proper prisoner of war facility. He was processed. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He was repatriated in 1947. He returned to Dresden. Elise was there. Anna, now 10 years old, was there. He had survived the desert and the recapture and the 8 minutes of silence in a command caravan and the war itself. He died in Dresden in 1971. In October of 1942, nearly a year after Baumann's recapture and Keyes' funeral, Adolf Hitler signed the Kommandobefehl, the commando order, 12 copies, classified above top secret. It stated that all Allied commando personnel captured behind German lines, regardless of whether they were in uniform, regardless of whether they surrendered, were to be handed immediately to the SS for execution. No tribunal, no documentation, no Geneva Convention. Rommel received his copy. He read it. He walked to the field stove in his command caravan. He burned it. Both pages. His aide, Hauptmann Armbruster, was present. He watched it burn. The fact of this burning is documented across multiple post-war accounts from Rommel's staff. It is consistent with the entire documented record of the Afrika Korps across 3 years of desert combat, a command that was never formally accused of war crimes. Not once. In 3 years. Across 3 countries. The record is that clean. And it is clean because of decisions like the one Rommel made on the morning of November 17, 1941, when he read an arrest report twice, set it face down on his desk, sat in silence for 8 minutes, and then told a 34-year-old supply officer from Dresden to take off the British jacket and go back to the processing system. He burned the commando order because Geoffrey Keyes was already in the ground with a German Iron Cross on his chest. He burned it because 26 British commandos who came to kill him were in prisoner of war facilities eating German rations. He burned it because Roy Wooldridge would one day sit in front of a table with beer and cigarettes. He burned it because the record he had built since February 1941, decision by decision, order by order, morning by morning, was not compatible with the document in his hands. He burned it knowing that 12 copies existed and that Berlin would eventually audit compliance. He burned it anyway. He watched both pages reduced to ash, and then he went back to work. On October 14, 1944, 3 years after the British jacket was returned through official channels and the ash of the commando order settled in the stove, a car arrived at the house in Hurlingen in the Swabian Alps where Rommel lived with Lucy and Manfred. 2 generals were in it. They had been sent by Hitler. Rommel had been named in the testimony of men who had been tortured following the July 20th assassination attempt. The connection was peripheral. He had known about the plot. He had not participated in the bomb. But his name was in the testimony. The 2 generals gave him a choice: a public trial before the People's Court, which would result in his execution and the arrest and possible harm to his family, or a private death by cyanide, after which he would be given a state funeral and his family would be protected. Rommel went upstairs. He said goodbye to Lucy. He said goodbye to Manfred, 15 years old, who later wrote that his father came in wearing his Afrika Korps jacket and said, "I'll be dead in 15 minutes." He got in a car. He took the cyanide on a road outside Hurlingen. He was dead in 15 minutes. The regime announced he had died of wounds from the Allied air attack on a staff car 3 months earlier. They gave him a state funeral with full military honors. His coffin was draped with the flag of the government that had poisoned him. The man who had ordered full military honors for the British officer who came to kill him was given full military honors by the regime that killed him. The symmetry is exact and entirely without comfort. Jeffrey Keyes is buried in the Benghazi War Cemetery in Libya, Plot 4, Row C, Grave 20. He was buried there by German soldiers under Rommel's orders. His Victoria Cross, awarded posthumously on June 19, 1942, is in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London. He was 24 years old. He had been in the British Army for 4 years. A memorial service was held at Westminster Abbey in London. His parents received the photographs that Rommel had ordered taken of the grave. His father, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes, kept them. Roy Wooldridge kept the empty cigarette packet from Rommel's mess for 71 years. He appeared on national television at the age of 95 and held it up. A man of 95, holding a cigarette packet from 1944. That is what 71 years of being alive, instead of being shot, looks like when you can hold it in your hand. Werner Friedrich Baumann returned to Dresden in 1947. He lived there until 1971. Anna, the 4-year-old in the garden photograph, was 34 years old when her father died. The same age he had been when Private Missner raised a rifle at a checkpoint at 4:47 in the morning and said halt. The Afrika Korps administrative records, the ones containing the notation about the returned British jacket, the processing documentation, the prisoner transfer records, are in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, Germany. The records of Operation Flipper, including the British planning documents and the subsequent accounts of Keyes' burial, are in the National Archives at Kew, in London. The road outside Hurlingen, where the car stopped and Rommel took the cyanide, is still there. Rommel's grave is in the cemetery at Hurlingen. His son Manfred, who was 15 years old on October 14, 1944, and who spent the next decades preserving and defending his father's record, died in 2013. He was 84 years old. Werner Baumann walked west because that was the direction of home. He made it 22 kilometers. It was not far enough. Rommel sent him back into the processing system with his own jacket and told him the desert was not an escape route. 3 years later, on a road outside Hurlingen, Rommel took the cyanide because the regime he had served had decided that a man who returns British jackets through official channels and burns orders he disagrees with and pins his iron cross on the chest of the enemy who came to kill him is not the kind of man a government like theirs can afford to leave alive. He was right about the desert not being an escape route. He was right about everything. He died on a road outside his house at 52 years old, with his Iron Cross already in the ground in Libya, on the chest of a 24-year-old Scottish officer who had come 250 miles by submarine and foot through the rain to find him. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to know what it looks like when a man does the right thing every time, even when the law does not require it, even when it costs him, all the way to the end. Hit like if you believe Jeffrey Keyes deserved the Iron Cross on his chest and the photographs sent to his parents. The next story I'm going to tell you involves a British officer who spent 37 days on the run in the Libyan desert after Operation Flipper, the longest documented solo desert evasion of the North African campaign, and what he found when he finally reached Allied lines that told him exactly how close the whole thing had come to working.